Hello. Welcome to, if you see me looking up to the corner here, I'm checking out, there it is, 11 o'clock. So 11 o'clock, we tend to always start on time. Thanks for attending. I see people are starting to log on and register. We're gonna go ahead and get this going. I keep the video on for just a second so you can see that I am live and I can answer questions. And on a broad topic like this, the more questions that come in, the better. So double checking. Let's see, feel free to introduce yourself. Thanks, Trang. And double check, and I'm guessing that everyone can hear me and see me, so I'm going to stop the video and I'll put myself on at the very end, maybe. Because the other thing you can't see is I got to take off my glasses so that I can see this computer screen. Okay, so this one is today's topic, predictable business-to-business lead generation strategies that work no matter what your budget. And with a topic like this, that that usually generates some decent interest, the challenge is that it's broad. So I'm going to ask for your help in that if you have questions, stick them over in the webinar, the chat. If you see the chat function on your the Zoom window, go ahead and use that. And then Trang and Nui will be monitoring it, and then they'll pass it over into the Q&A. Or I'll check the chat here and there as I'm going through the presentation. But by all means, check if you have any questions or if there's something that you want to cover, let's get it done. But let me roll through my agenda. I always start these things with definitions. So let's just make sure that we're on the same page, that when I say that we're doing business-to-business lead generation, that it's the same definition that you have of business-to-business lead generation. We're going to run through, we use a little MQL, a marketing qualified lead and sales qualified lead grid. So I'm going to go a little deeper into that because I've thrown it up in other webinars and shared it with people here and there, but there is a way to work through it. And we'll kind of do a high level overview of how to work that grid. We'll talk about if the goal is to build a predictable lead generation machine that gives us leads that we can count on month in, month out, and that we can actually predict what's going to happen into the future as far as our new opportunities that are coming in. We'll work from the future back to today, and then I'll cover a Q&A as well as what some very first steps are based on the presentation I just gave. So before we get started, if you have any questions or if there's anything you're hoping to get out of today, go ahead and throw it into the chat, because I'm going to move to the next thing, which is I'm going to do a quick poll. So for the early attendees always get to vote on these polls. Later people, they only get to hear the mystery. And the people, if you're watching this as a recording in the future, you don't get to participate. But if there's any questions, feel free to ask any questions. They are in there. Let me run through this quick survey. So I'm going to launch a poll. Launch poll. Okay, there's 3 questions that are in this poll. And they are, who's responsible for your lead generation efforts, your company's lead generation efforts, if you could answer that question. And then on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being horrible, 10 being we're the best, how would you rank how would you score your company's lead generation efforts? And then the last question is, if I asked you to predict the number of good leads you'll have next month, how accurate would you be? Within 10%, 25, 50%. So if you see that poll, can anybody see it? Because we're not, or if you see it, at least somebody, I should allow the panelists to vote at least. So I see you out there. I see you out there. And if you look, there we go. So there's a couple. No one's really responsible for lead generation efforts. I'm responsible for my own, right? We see that quite a bit. It'd be a guess as to the way it goes. I'm going to let this run for just a couple more seconds as the votes come in, and then I'll share the results with you. And this just gives me a gauge as to matching the content that I'm about to go through with you guys that are out there. All right, give you a few more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Let me go ahead and end this and then share the results. Okay, so sharing the poll results, you're responsible for your own lead generation efforts. It sounds like for the most of you, or the sales team is, as opposed to the marketing team. So this this will be interesting, but I think you'll find that it doesn't. We don't get too much into individual prospecting efforts, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. And then, yeah, as far as people saying, like, do we know whether or not, are we able to predict the leads? The goal is always to be within that, like within that 25%, which a couple of you are, or within 10%, where we can look forward and say, we expect 100 to come in. And if it's 90 or if it's 110, we're going to be right there. So let me stop that piece, and then we'll jump into the next question. All right, let's start, as we always start, with defining terms. The wise people have said that they'd spend most of their time trying to define terms rather than working on the problem. So if we are trying to define the terms, lead gen to us, so to us, GoLeads, it's the process of finding new sales opportunities. And for us, whether that comes from new customers, new prospects, old prospects, that is less important than being able to have a new opportunity presented in front of us. So when we say lead generation, that's what we're talking about, just so that we're on the same page. Another piece you'll see me refer to here and there, and I've asked for more clarification on this. I've been asked for more clarification on this. It's the rule of 30. We say the rule of 30, and we use it a lot internally. It's that studies show that it takes 10 impressions, 10 touches before a message gets through. So that's a single message being presented 10 times. And not only does it need to be presented 10 times, but today in our busy environments, with all the information that's flying at us, they say that it takes only 1 in 3 messages get through. So the rule of 30 is planning on how do we get 30 impressions of a single message in front of our prospects over time. And because that is what helps them recognize what it is that we're trying to do, right? So when we're talking about lead generation, most of the time it's involved in this rule of 30. How many times does it have to go out? A few of you are individual salespeople, and you know, rarely is it just a single call close. And again, that depends on the product, it depends on the service, it depends on a lot of different things. But for the most part, what we're going to talk about is something that's somewhere between the single call close and the 100 call super complex lead generation process. And when we talk about that, we end up using this grid quite a bit, which is our MQL SQL, our marketing qualified leads versus sales qualified leads. It's taking that idea of leads that we just threw out in the top part, and recognizing that there is a handoff somewhere in between there, between what a marketing, if marketing is one-to-many and sales is one-to-one, the one-to-many advertising marketing efforts that go out there, there's a difference when it gets handed off over to the sales one-to-one conversations that go on that actually move people towards a decision. So on the left, we have, is the prospect aware of the solution, yes or no? And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the coming slides. And then working across the top is the solution valuable to the prospect? And that's via the prospect. Not do we think it's valuable to the prospect, but where does the prospect recognize that it is valuable to them? And is it, oh, this is interesting, minor? This is significant, this is something that I could be interested in, significant? Or is it game changing? I can't live without this. I really need it. The sample that I threw up here is, if somebody is really not, if we gave them the solution and they've never heard of our company before, they're kind of in that lower left. They're not aware of the solution that we provide, and and even if they were aware, they're not all that excited about it. We consider that, in this case, we use it. We say, oh, that would be a marketing qualified lead, which is there's somebody who are on our list, but they aren't somebody who are close to purchasing. On the upper right-hand side, just to contrast that, is the prospect is aware of us and our solution. And not only that, they view the solution as being important to their business, right? It's going to produce results. It's going to fix a problem that they are actively interested in. that is more of, that's what, when salespeople think of leads, that's what they want in general, is something where I can go out and have this good conversation with these people, but they're primed. It's going to be close to a sale. Where it gets, the fuzzy parts are all the in-betweens. And so when we think about a sales cycle, if this is McKinsey's sales cycle that they use between, identifying and researching and consider and evaluate, right? That's almost like a buying, sales, buying, a presentation and purchasing cycle that includes both the sales team, the salesperson, and the customer. Where this fits in is, for instance, more that sales qualified lead is right in that very beginning of the process, just so that we're on the same page. Whereas these marketing qualified leads are actually not even on this grid. If we spend a lot of time inside the sales process, and how do we get them to consider and evaluate and build a formal proposal, etc., these marketing qualified leads they're out of the circle entirely. So when we're talking about generating leads, we're talking about those two spaces in that lead generation. So I'm about to go into working the grid. So using this grid, this is how it works inside of a company. So, and this is where I thought that we needed to get a little deeper into this. When I threw it up in the last webinar that we did, a couple of people were like, I don't get that thing at all. So this is how it works inside of your own company. This is a sample grid that's just thrown up, and I did my own definition of MQL and SQL in here. But what I'm talking about is the way to build predictable leads inside of your company is to get good at defining these lines that are in between. So the marketing qualified lead, sales qualified lead concept is important, just because it gives us an outline where we can have a good internal discussion about what the differences are between these things. But the power is really in defining if what is, yes, it is a marketing qualified lead, or I'm sorry, yes, the prospect is aware of us and our solution, versus no. Like, what does that mean? What does it mean? What's the difference between minor and significant? What's the difference between significant and game changing? Putting definitions on those internally helps the most. It's really the most important part when we look at generating predictable leads. Can we do those things? So let me give you an example, and let's use that on the left there. That is the prospect aware of the solution. So for example, if I say, we say internally, we talk about aware, like when is the prospect aware? And what moves them from no to yes is a question that we would ask. Is it when they've had, for instance, 3 touches? So I talked to some marketing teams and they said, when we've gotten, so using that rule of 30 again, if we've gotten, 10, 12 attempts to get in front of this person by literature or emails, or we've invited them places, or we've met them at trade shows, that's where, that number of touches is what moves them from no to yes. So what was that? How does that work inside of your company, right? Is it, it's 3 touches, it's 6 touches, they've attended a webinar, they've actually physically asked a question of the organization, more than just being aware of, they've heard of us. Where does it fit inside of your organization? And that's the most important part, right? It doesn't matter what Greg thinks, what I think. This is how you should do it. It's what you think. And the little is not box that I put over on the side here is the tool that I use to run through questioning. So if we were sitting together in a room, we were trying to figure this out, define these lines so that we could better communicate what we're after when we talk about predictable lead generation, we would use this. And we would say, for instance, does it matter where they found out about us, right? So using that left-hand side, if you can see the is not, I wouldn't use this little annotation thing, but I'm afraid to start clicking around. So is it the is not, like where have they heard it? Is it when, like when are they moved from yes, they're aware to not, or versus not being aware of us? What is it that they do, right? That's kind of that question is that, yes, they are in the aware situation if they have asked a question of us, but if they have not, they it's not there. So that's how we would use it, right? Is we would sit and just throw it out and say, give us some examples of what is of what awareness is, and how do we define what awareness is? Because the more we know about that, the more we can define whose responsibility it is to move them to the next space, right? If we define awareness and then we have a minor perceived minor value from the prospect, whose job is it then to move it towards a sales qualified lead, the type of lead that we're actually going to be working on? And that would be, in this definition here, I use marketing qualified lead. I say it's marketing's job. It's marketing's job to move them up and start to teach them. Yes, we know they know about us, but now we need to start to teach them that that it really would have a significant impact on their business and not a minor impact. Whatever it would give them more or less of, and it's something that they would work. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense, because it's really that piece of this defining of terms, right? Plato said the beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms, right? So it goes way back. And by being able to define where the handoffs are and who fits into which part of the grid, and actually, where does this grid come from? If you ask, Greg, where does this grid come from? It comes from it's an old direct marketing recency, frequency, monetary grid analysis, simplified so that we can use it inside of most companies. And that's why we say, regardless of who your company is or what your budget is, thinking in these terms, a little bit of a data analysis way of approaching lead generation, that's how we're able to get these going. So where do we start, right? The way to move through, the way to get predictable lead generation is start with the definitions, but it's also in how do we get to the point where we're able to predict it? And that's what we need to do, is we need to figure out where we are today, right? I don't have any ability to predict the number of leads that come in, could be an answer. And there's really nobody working on it. Is today, okay, so that makes sense. That's where you're at today, but it's where would you like to be in the future? And what we try to do here is try to elevate that into, regardless of where you're at today, say 5 years in the future, far enough out that it's that we don't get bogged down in today. How do we know what it is that we're trying to do and what we're working towards? Like, what would a predictable lead generation ideal future look like at that time? So the reason we need to move this direction, and what I usually say is we want to move from the future back to today, is because every time we think about today, we get stuck in our daily limits, right? It's the limits of the dollars that we have in hand. Gotcha, David. And you don't have to. The good news is you can hang up at any time. So seeing, but if you can start with the future and then work back today, it's a lot more powerful than if you start with today and move forward into the future. So for instance, like here's an exercise that we have. A long time ago, I've got a friend, he is able to talk most of us into doing things that we would not normally do. And one of the things he suggested was, hey, let's run a marathon. Well, at the time, I was unable to run a marathon, right? I could barely run 2.5 miles. So the thought of running a full marathon was impossible. So tying this into the future, it turns out when you go to run a marathon, if you've never done this before, you can look at these schedules, and the first thing it starts with is when is the marathon? So you get these schedules online that are like, oh, it's an 18-week marathon preparation schedule, and you start by putting the date in of when the marathon is, and then you work back to today. The point I'm trying to make here is that when you're trying to build a predictable lead generation effort, trying to build a tool, the first thing you need to start with is, what is the future really look like? So what is if you know what the marathon is and how long it is and what it's going to take, what do we have to do working back to today, as opposed to working from today into the future. Because working today into the future, what ends up happening is we abandon these efforts way too early, and we never get to where it is that we're trying to get to. Does that make sense? So when I say working backwards, when we have 5 years out, we say, oh, this is what the idealized future is, right? It's, I want to have, you know, 100 leads per person, right? So I want to have, because that usually, and I want it to produce, you know, 15 sales qualified leads. So 100 marketing qualified leads, of which 15 of those become sales qualified. And then I can work that, my regular 10-3-1 close rate in the in-between time. So if that's the future, and then we say, oh, and then how many reps are you going to have? Oh, I'd like to have 10 reps. Okay, so we're working towards getting 150 sales qualified leads and 100 or 1,000 marketing qualified leads, say month in, month out, if that's the way that our cycle is going to work. To work backwards from that, right? So today, where are you at? Well, we're at 0, and we have, you know, 1 sales rep, and we have we don't really keep track of leads. Okay, so it sounds like a daunting task today, but if we work from the future backwards, right? We start and we say, well, if this is what we want at the very end in year 5, what do we want in year 4? Right before perfect. What kind of people, what are our people resources? What are our revenue resources? What kind of investment is involved? What kind of technology do we need to have in place in order to be ready for 1,000 marketing qualified leads and 150 sales qualified leads to come in month in, month out? So if that's year 4, what is year 3? And then what is year 2, right? All the way back to today, we can start with what it is that we need to do starting right now. So the way that this works when we read it is we say the number 1 up in the corner is you really need to define idealized future as clearly as you can. This is what we're working towards. And then number 2 is that the L in the corner, which is identify the gap. How far away are we from today? And then number 3 is what are the steps we need to take working backwards from the future to today? So that's how we start towards this idea of being able to generate ideas. This is what GoLeads did when we first started, was if we were going to be able to grow and provide this many leads, how do we get there? And then this is the question that we ask ourselves every day when we say, what are we working towards? We're working towards generating, you know, if we want to generate 10 times as many leads, what do we have to do right now? So if you're wondering, if you thought, oh, I never noticed that you guys did any webinars before, well, that's part of what we're doing going forward, is we needed to educate our audience better so that we could be able to offer them some of these other services that we're able to offer, as a for instance. And it doesn't start with just launching into, hey, buy this new service from us. It really does help us. The way we're going to get there is we got to help you guys understand what it is that we're trying to do. And so when you're wondering, like, okay, so where does that come from? Where does this idealized future piece come from? It always comes back to the customer. We can use that framework, but what we need to do is we need to get the what from the who, right? So if we know that we want to produce 1,000 leads, and we have an idea of what we would consider a lead, the one piece that's missing from this is a lot of times it's happening inside of the building. So how do we get out of the building? Well, the way we get out to the building is we got to go talk to the customers. And we got to get some evidence. We need to figure out where it is that if our people are going to consider, if we think that this is a perfect solution for our products, or for our prospects, we have customers that are doing things with us right now. How do we find more of them? It usually starts with that customer, right? So in-person surveys are the most powerful way to get information. And it's by asking them about their decision process before they started working with you, right? Back when they were prospects. So we surveyed them in person, and this is what we did. And you may have been on the receiving end of some of these calls that we did about 18 months ago. We survey in person, then we survey on the phone, and then we do online surveys, which is the easiest one to do, but also probably the least powerful. Surveying face-to-face in person is the most powerful way to get the information we need to build a predictable lead generation machine. We find third-party information. There's tons of it out there that may or may not apply to our company exactly, kind of like that grid, but it gives us a place where we can at least check our information before we start moving forward. So we can check our assumptions on there. And like I said, it's going slow to go fast. So the reason this whole process works is because when we go backwards, oops, here, when we're starting at the future and then working back to today, it gives us a chance. We go a little bit slower at the beginning, but then we're able to speed up results at the end. So that's what we do. And then and talking to customers, we always start with customers and then we move to prospects. Because once we know more about what the customer is doing, then we can apply that same, we can find prospects that look like these customers, but we go out with the same thing with nothing to sell. We're not trying to find out anything from them except for how is it that you perceive what it is that we have going on inside this. So if that makes sense. The way to build a predictable lead generation machine is to start on paper, but then realize after we have it built, all the answers are outside of the office. Then we need to go out and we need to talk to customers. So we make a list of everything that we know or would love to know about their process, their decision process, right? Questions like, a big list of things that we'd love to know, but we'd love to know like what it is that they want, what would a prospect want, how would they know they need it, how big is their problem, how would they measure it, what is their ROI, should something like that be implemented, what constraints are out there. But all these questions come from a place of we're not prescribing anything to them, we're not trying to sell them anything, we're just trying to figure out how we would go about generating them as a lead. You can always reapproach people, but you got to get the how from the who is the way we say it around here. And then, yeah, the big song is don't get stuck in trying to improve your results today. So if you have no idea what leads are coming in next month and you have no idea, really, you haven't spent any time defining a lead, the trick is that when it comes to June of 2019, are you still operating the same way, or have you at least started making some improvements towards building a predictable lead machine? The clients that we've worked with that we do this for, oftentimes the first thing it starts with is just having a level, whatever the dollar amount is, having a level amount of a level spend on marketing, and then working to build leads from there. Once we can start to generate leads with whatever the dollar amount is, then it makes it easier to invest in the future going forward. So predictable lead generation becomes our big piece. So I don't know, is this too esoteric? Am I being too theoretical here? This is the part where you can ask me questions about what this is, as well as maybe bring in some of your own individual, this is what I was hoping to look for. Typical questions we get here is like people say, Greg, who is it that paints the future? Like, who is it that helps identify the idealized future? In a perfect world, right, it always starts at the top. But if you're deep inside of an organization and you don't get to set that, then you can set it for yourself. It doesn't hurt as long as it's aligned with what your company is trying to do. You should be able to set an idealized future for yourself and find ways to work towards it, like that marathon example. So it can work from the bottom up. Other questions I've been asked is, hey, Greg, we're a startup. So what do we do there? We have 0 customers. We have 0 evidence. And I would say then this process of talking to prospects or talking to customers is probably the most important part. And if I would spend any time doing anything, my daughter is working on a startup, and that's what she needs to do, right? Is she needs to go out, and I'm like, you just need to get in front of the people who you think are your target market and ask them a lot of questions. You're a long way away from being able to build a predictable lead generation machine, but the way it starts is you really got to get to know the customer better. So what about this question? I need revenue today. Because I've got quota, I've got revenue and quota hanging over me. So what you're talking about really doesn't help me today. And Oh, all I can do on that is to say there is this, I'm going to try to draw this. The S curve of growth is what it's called. But if this is the S curve of growth, can't create curve. It every time that you implement change happens at this level. And it feels like nothing is happening. And then what we always see happen is it's a jump in activity to the next plateau. And there is always a plateau because this is where the next bunch of change happens. So if you're here today and you need to be here tomorrow, it's not going to be a straight line. It's going to take time. And so that's why we need to work on defining what it is that this future is so that we can take steps along the way. And how will we know it's working? That's where you look for leading indicators along the way. What are some of these leading indicators that tell us we're at least on the right track? And then the revenue piece usually follows and jumps way up here. So if you're a salesperson, you'd love to be in an organization right about there where they've already figured everything out before the next jump, but then before the market, before they make the next group of changes right here. So that's my advice if you are looking for that. If you're confused on defining MQL and SQL, the marketing qualified leads and sales qualified leads for your organization, just set up a time. We'll walk through it. I can walk you through some of the exercises. It's a consulting service that we offer, but I will do it for you because you've been sitting through this thing. And who does this? There's a question like, well, who are you working with that's actually doing this? We do have a great example of this S-curve is a lawyer that we were working with. And the first thing we needed to do here was his marketing spend was up and down. So once we leveled it out, even though it was at this level, where he was always like, oh, I spend $3,000 every month on leads, we needed to bring it down to $750 that he could do month in, month out. So even when he bumped into his worst case scenario month where it was just all expenses that were going out, he could still afford to do this. And we were after this piece where we had a certain kind of leads we were trying to generate. And what he found was just that, right? His little S-curve of growth was the same way. At first, it didn't feel like much was happening, but he was seeing some indicators that it was happening. And then boom, it jumped up. And then he had to hire another lawyer to come in and help work the cases. And then we're working in the middle of this next piece, which is, unfortunately, this little trick is not going to work exactly the way it worked when he was first getting started, but we will have other ideas that can help move him forward. So it's like, I don't know if you've seen the Shawshank Redemption is what I like to think about, but the Tim Robbins character when I forget the other guy. when Hoke is explaining what he was doing, it was geology is a study of pressure and time, and that's what we're doing. Is we're trying to apply lead generation pressure to our prospects over time, and that's what generates the results that we're after. So you've been very patient. Let me turn this off and get to the good parts here. Everyone loves freebies. And how do you get that annotation off? Clear all of my drawings. There it goes. Everybody loves freebies. And so by attending this, we're going to go ahead and get you this. So I go a little deeper into how to do strategy versus planning, and how to use the MQL SQL grid in the book, The Human Being's Guide to Business Growth. You get a copy of this just for attending. On there. Also, the perfect growth formula. I was talking to Bill about this morning because some of our clients, as much as they love the details of the work, they really need help identifying what is lead generation online versus lead generation offline, and how does it all work together. The perfect growth formula gives you the tools for that and has a nice assessment in it where you can assess where your business is at. And then this is a new tool that we're putting together called the Lead Gen Compass. It's also, it was formerly known as Lead Gen Tools, but that's how new it is. We're changing it all the time. But right now, I don't see any questions coming in. You'll have to let me know if this was valuable or not valuable out there. But predictable lead generation is the goal. That's what the Lead Gen Compass tool is meant to do. And if you're wondering what what that means. It actually does everything that we just talked about in here, but it's provided to you as a service at what seems to be, from the people who are in our pilot program, they're telling us that it's almost scarily inexpensive. But our goal is to help you apply pressure over time. So it does just enough that we can keep those touches coming so that you can get and build a predictable lead generation machine, which helps you in many, many ways. Thanks for attending. I've cut this just over a half hour. And if we have nothing else, if you have any questions, email me, gchambers@goleadsconsulting.com. I'll send you a copy of the slides, all the registrants, and a link to all these materials, and look for that early next week. Thanks for your time, and I will talk to you later.